Soldiers and civilians across World War II faced the same problem: brutal cold, no blankets, supply systems that had completely collapsed. The Eastern Front dropped to -40. Leningrad's 3 million trapped civilians had no fuel. American troops at the Bulge froze in the coldest European winter on record. Everyone needed insulation. What they found, what actually worked better than the wool blankets that never came, was something you'd never expect. Something so ordinary that most people threw it away. Something that homeless populations had known about for generations. During the worst winters in modern warfare, this forgotten material saved lives through simple physics. Here's what kept people alive when the cold tried to kill them. December 1941. The Eastern Front temperature drops to -35 degrees Celsius. German forces are still wearing the uniforms they invaded in: summer-weight tunics, standard-issue boots, no winter coats. Hitler bet the war would end before winter. He lost that bet. Now his soldiers are paying for it. The cold hits like a weapon. Rifles freeze and won't fire. Vehicle engines seize. Soldiers can't pull triggers because their fingers have gone numb. Frostbite doesn't ask permission. It just takes toes, fingers, noses, ears. The medics start counting amputations instead of bullet wounds. At the same time, 900 miles northwest, Leningrad is surrounded. The siege begins September 8th, just as autumn turns cold. 3 million people are trapped inside the city. The Germans cut the last supply line. By the time winter arrives, there's no heating fuel left, no electricity, no way in or out except across a frozen lake that German artillery targets constantly. The temperature in Leningrad drops to -30. People burn furniture to stay warm. Then they burn books. Then they burn whatever's left. February takes 100,000 lives. Most freeze before they starve. These are the two worst places to be in winter 1941. Different wars, same problem. The cold is killing everyone, and there's nothing to stop it. The German army had plans for winter equipment: wool coats, insulated boots, proper gloves. All of it existed on paper. Warehouses back in Germany held supplies, but getting them to soldiers freezing in Russia required trains, and the trains were busy moving ammunition. Then the supply depots got prioritized for other fronts. Then winter came anyway. Historian Omer Bartov documented what happened next. Soldiers waited for equipment that never arrived. The winter gear was always 2 weeks away, then a month, then indefinitely delayed. By December, men were wearing the same uniforms they'd crossed the Soviet border in during June. The numbers tell part of the story. By the end of 1941, the Wehrmacht had 100,000 frostbite casualties. Doctors amputated nearly 15,000 limbs, not from combat wounds, but from tissue death caused by cold. Some units lost more men to winter than to Soviet guns. In Leningrad, the supply situation was simpler. There wasn't one. The blockade was complete. No food convoys, no fuel shipments, no deliveries of warm clothing. What people had in September was all they'd have until the siege broke. Ration cards became worthless when the warehouses emptied. Wool blankets, if anyone still owned them, were traded for bread or burned for heat. The same pattern repeated on other fronts. American soldiers at the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 faced one of the coldest European winters on record. Equipment wore out in weeks instead of the expected months. Boots fell apart. Wool socks lasted 15 days instead of 4 months. The supply chain couldn't keep up with how fast the cold destroyed everything. The gap between what commanders planned and what soldiers had was measured in degrees of body temperature. That gap killed people. When the wool blankets didn't come, soldiers improvised. They stuffed straw into their boots. They wrapped rags around their hands. They took coats off dead bodies, German or Soviet. Neither side had a monopoly on freezing. Some tried packing animal feed inside their uniforms. Others layered on every piece of clothing they could scavenge from abandoned villages. In Leningrad, civilians wore everything they owned at once. 3 shirts, 2 coats, every pair of socks in the house. People slept in their winter clothes and added more layers when they went outside. The cold worked through fabric, through walls, through whatever barriers people tried to build between their bodies and the air. Experimentation became survival. Try straw. Does it help? Try rags. Do they trap heat? Try whatever's in that abandoned building. Anything work? The testing happened under conditions where failure meant death. German soldiers crammed straw into their boots and walked until their feet went numb anyway. They pulled straw out, tried wrapping cloth around their feet instead, tested different materials, learned which combinations kept sensation in their toes for a few more hours. Leningrad residents stripped wallpaper off walls because the paste was made from potato starch and could be boiled into something resembling soup. But before they boiled it, some people noticed the paper itself had a use. Wrapped around a child's chest, layered between clothing and skin, it seemed to trap warmth. People were testing materials the way engineers test prototypes, except the stakes were digits and limbs instead of product launches. The soldiers found newspapers in abandoned buildings, propaganda sheets, old editions of army bulletins, anything printed on paper. They started stuffing it into their uniforms, just to see if it helped. It did. The material that worked was newspaper, ordinary paper, printed with yesterday's news or last week's propaganda. A Wehrmacht soldier stuffs crumpled newspaper under his tunic and feels warmth spreading across his chest. Not much, maybe a few degrees, but a few degrees is the difference between keeping your fingers and losing them. He tells the soldier next to him. That soldier tries it, then another. The technique spreads through the unit without any official order. In Leningrad, a mother wraps her child in pages from Pravda before sending him outside. The kid comes home with sensation still in his hands. She tells other mothers. They try it with their own children. It works often enough that people keep doing it. The method spread because you could feel when it worked. You put newspaper between your skin and your coat. You crumpled it first. That seemed important, though nobody knew why yet. Then you moved carefully so the paper didn't tear. If it stayed in place, you stayed warmer. If it fell apart, you replaced it with more newspaper. Different populations discovered the same solution independently. German soldiers on the Eastern Front, Soviet civilians in besieged cities, American GIs at the Battle of the Bulge. Finnish forces fighting in the Winter War developed their own version. Instead of crumpling the paper, they folded it into accordion-like structures that trapped air more efficiently. The Finnish Defense Forces documented this technique and used it successfully from 1939 through 1945. The U.S. Army even tested paper underwear as cold weather equipment during the war. The official assessment: paper underwear was windproof and warm, but it tended to go to pieces too easily when wet. The report noted that the warmth factor was surprising, proving that bums on a park bench have sound ideas. That last line reveals something. The military knew this was a technique borrowed from homeless people. Street survival knowledge became battlefield survival knowledge. The war made more people desperate enough to try it. Evidence that it worked comes from multiple sources. Bartov's research on the Eastern Front documents that soldiers insulated themselves from the cold with newspapers until those too ran out. Military supply records mention newspaper insulation as evidence of equipment shortages. Veteran interviews reference stuffing boots and uniforms with paper. The technique appears in enough independent accounts that it can't be dismissed as rumor. People used newspaper because it was there when nothing else was, and it kept them alive. Newspaper works as insulation because of its structure. Paper is made from cellulose fibers, tiny plant-based strands pressed together during manufacturing. When you crumple newspaper, you're not compressing it into a solid mass. You're creating thousands of small air pockets between the fibers. Air is a terrible conductor of heat. That's why insulation works, not because the material itself is special, but because it traps air. A wool blanket traps air between its fibers. Fiberglass insulation traps air in its structure. Crumpled newspaper does the same thing. The difference is quantity. A single wool blanket gives you one layer of trapped air. Crumpled newspaper, stuffed between your shirt and your coat, creates dozens of separate air chambers. Each pocket acts as a barrier to heat transfer. Stack enough barriers together, and you've built effective insulation. The thermal conductivity of paper is roughly equivalent to wool. Tests on cellulose insulation, which is just processed newspaper, show performance around R3.6 to R3.8 per inch. That's comparable to traditional insulation materials. Paper follows the same physics as expensive military equipment. The weight matters too. Wool is heavy. A wool blanket that provides adequate insulation weighs several pounds. The same insulating effect from crumpled newspaper weighs almost nothing. For a soldier carrying ammunition and equipment, or a civilian who's already weak from hunger, weight is survival. Lighter insulation means you can move. Movement means you can find food or shelter or escape danger. Newspaper conforms to your body in ways a stiff blanket can't. You can stuff it into boots, around joints, between layers of clothing. It fills gaps. A blanket hangs loose and lets cold air circulate underneath. Crumpled paper packs tight and blocks airflow. The Finnish folding technique worked even better. Instead of crumpling, soldiers folded papers into accordion-like structures, multiple layers with air spaces between them, but organized enough that they didn't fall apart. This created insulation that was both effective and durable enough to last through a patrol. There's one major problem: newspaper falls apart when wet. Sweat, snow, rain, any moisture causes paper to disintegrate. Then you're left with soggy pulp that doesn't insulate anything, but in extreme cold, moisture freezes before it can soak through. And if the paper does fall apart, you find more newspaper. As long as buildings still stand, there are printed pages inside them. The physics explains why free trash outperformed expensive military equipment that never arrived. Crumpled newspaper performed the same function as wool, and newspaper was actually available. Newspapers were meant to carry information about the war. German propaganda sheets told soldiers about inevitable victory. Soviet papers reported heroic resistance. Everyone used print to shape how people understood what was happening. Then those same pages got stuffed into boots to prevent frostbite. A German soldier on the Eastern Front might read a propaganda bulletin about the glorious advance, then crumple that bulletin and shove it inside his uniform because the advance had stalled in negative 40-degree cold and the winter coats hadn't arrived. The pages promising victory became the thing keeping him alive long enough to experience defeat. Berlin, bombs fell on the city's newspaper district while German soldiers in Russia used old German newspapers for insulation. Information and survival collapsed into the same physical object. Newspaper remained available when wool didn't because of supply chain priorities. Wool was needed for military uniforms and blankets. It went to factories making equipment for soldiers. Paper wasn't a strategic material. Newspapers kept publishing throughout the war because propaganda mattered, and old newspapers just piled up as waste. Nobody was recycling them for the war effort. That made them accessible when more valuable materials had been consumed. Even in Leningrad under siege, people had old newspapers. The printing presses stopped, but homes still held papers from before the blockade. Those pages became insulation after everything else was burned or eaten. Then the war ended, and everyone wanted to forget they'd survived by stuffing garbage into their clothes. Using newspaper for warmth was associated with homelessness, with poverty, with desperation. Middle-class soldiers didn't want to remember using techniques borrowed from people living on park benches. Families didn't want to talk about wrapping their children in old propaganda. Military historians wrote about battles and strategies, not about how soldiers actually stayed alive between engagements. The survival techniques that saved thousands of lives weren't heroic enough for the history books. Nobody wanted to document that armies spent millions on equipment that never arrived while soldiers survived with free newspaper. The technique got erased from memory because it reminded people of their own desperation. Too mundane, too associated with failure, too much evidence that official systems had collapsed and individuals had to save themselves. The knowledge didn't completely disappear. Homeless populations worldwide still use newspaper insulation. They stuff it into jackets, wrap it around their bodies, pack it into sleeping bags. The same physics that worked in 1941 works now. In 2007, a Canadian project called 15 Below created a jacket specifically designed for homeless people, with pockets that could be stuffed with crumpled newspaper for insulation. They tested it in controlled conditions, negative 18 degrees Celsius for 7.5 hours, then negative 30 for 45 minutes. The test subject wore only a thin fleece shirt under the newspaper-stuffed jacket. He stayed comfortable through the entire test. Modern survival guides include newspaper insulation as an emergency technique. Emergency preparedness experts recommend keeping old newspapers in winter survival kits. The military knowledge became civilian knowledge, became forgotten knowledge, became survival knowledge again. The material hasn't changed. Physics hasn't changed. What changed is that most people now have better options: synthetic insulation, modern winter clothing, heated buildings. All of that makes newspaper insulation unnecessary under normal circumstances. But the circumstances in 1941 weren't normal. Supply systems failed. Strategic miscalculations left soldiers freezing. Sieges cut cities off from the outside world. Under those conditions, the most effective insulation was the most available. We forgot this story because we wanted to remember the war differently. We remember the battles, the strategies, the heroes. We don't remember people stuffing propaganda sheets into their boots to keep their toes from dying. That image doesn't fit the narrative of triumph and sacrifice. Somewhere in the ruins of Leningrad, a mother wraps her daughter in pages from a newspaper that promised victory. The ink smudges against the child's skin, the paper crinkles with every breath. Outside, the temperature has dropped below -30 and there's no fuel left to burn. The blockade will last 872 days. Most of the people in this building won't survive it, but tonight, wrapped in yesterday's lies about how the war is going, the child stays warm enough to sleep. On the Eastern Front, a German soldier reads about the glorious advance, then tears the page in half and stuffs it inside his boot. His toes have been numb for 3 days. The paper helps. Not much. Enough. Tomorrow he'll find more pages in another abandoned village. There's always more newspaper. There's never enough wool. This is what survival looked like when the systems failed and the cold came anyway. No grand strategy, no superior equipment, just physics, desperation, and whatever materials people could find in the rubble. The pages that carried the war's propaganda became the insulation that kept people alive long enough to see how the propaganda lied. We built monuments to the battles. We wrote histories of the strategies. We remembered the heroes and the victories. But we forgot the newspapers stuffed into freezing boots, the crumpled pages wrapped around starving children, the simple physics that mattered more than all the wool blankets that never came. The technique still works. The physics haven't changed. People still use it when they have nothing else. But we don't talk about it because it reminds us that survival isn't heroic. Survival is ugly and desperate and grateful for garbage that happens to trap air. Somewhere tonight, someone is cold. They have no blankets, no proper winter gear, no supply system coming to save them. They find an old newspaper. They crumple it up. They stuff it inside their jacket. The warmth spreads slowly across their chest. A few degrees. Enough to matter. Enough to survive one more night. The war ended. The soldiers went home. The sieges broke. But the cold never stopped trying to kill people, and the newspaper never stopped working.